A common fate for battleships constructed during the 1940s was missing the chance to use their guns in their intended role. These ships were built too late to see the great ship battles and were generally relegated to secondary duty, escorting their successors as Queen of the Seas, the aircraft carrier, bombarding shore targets from France to the Pacific Islands, or serving as a deterrent to keep other battleships from getting any ideas. A ship that exemplifies this fate is USS Alabama, the final member of the second South Dakota-class. Here you have a ship launched too late to see the battles off Guadalcanal, a ship that missed the chance to duel Jean Bart, as her sister took that honor. A battleship that never got to fire her guns at other battleships, or even other ships in general. Her guns would be reserved for shore bombardment and action against aircraft. In the end, and in spite of her lack of major surface actions, she survived to become one of 3 non-Iowa-class fast battleship museums. Something that I maintain there is no problem with, even in light of other ships missing that chance. Because, after all, I think that a ship shouldn't be judged on her big flashy moments, and that even ships that gave quiet but steady service still deserve being remembered. And with that in mind, let's get into USS Alabama's service. Laid down on February 1st, 1940, she would enter the water on February 16th, 1942, almost exactly 2 years later. This speed of construction is reflective of American industry ramping up for a two-front naval war, with all that implies. Her actual commissioning on August 16th of the same year is a further example of this, though it should be looked at through the lens of commissioning date doesn't mean date of entering into proper service. Her shakedown cruise only began on November 11th, almost 3 months later. This, in concert with sea trials, would make sure her equipment was working properly, which is as good a point as any to talk about that equipment. At a designed tonnage of 35,000 tons, she was the last treaty-limited battleship of the United States Navy. Her actual tonnage, when fully loaded, was more like 45,000 tons. This was a reflection of the extra equipment stuff aboard, as well as just general growth and displacement common to ships upon entering service. This tonnage allowed for a ship that could, while admittedly cramped, carry 9 16-inch 45 caliber guns and 20 5-inch 38s as well. Her main battery was carried in the traditional, by this point, layout of 2 triple turrets superfiring on the bow and 1 triple turret on the stern. The 5-inch guns, for their part, were split between 5 twin mounts on either side of the ship, clustered around her superstructure. Her anti-aircraft battery was initially designed with a mix of 50 caliber machine guns, 1.1-inch cannon, and 20mm cannon. This would change multiple times over the war in classic American fashion of sticking a gun on every flat space, though it generally consisted of removing the machine guns and 1.1-inch cannon for more 20mm and a bunch of 40mm Bofors guns. Alabama's armor belt, meanwhile, was a thick 12.2-inch main belt that was heavily inclined to increase actual protection. This was a choice made to make her at least theoretically capable of resisting 16-inch shell fire. As for her deck armor, that was equally as impressive at 6 inches. To get all of this up to speed, Alabama carried 8 boilers that could generate 130,000 shaft horsepower. This brought her top speed up to 27.5 knots, which is admittedly on the slower end compared to European fast battleships outside the King George V class. Perfectly sufficient for keeping up with any Japanese battleship, barring the Congo class. Now, with that out of the way, it wouldn't be until the new year, 1943, that Alabama entered proper service. After further training cruises up and down the East Coast, she was sent across the Atlantic with her sister South Dakota. In this, the 2 battleships were helping the Royal Navy keep an eye on German forces while protecting Arctic convoys. Specifically, they were intended to counter the battleships Tirpitz and Scharnhorst in support of the British home fleet. The British were occupied supporting operations in the Mediterranean, and they needed the extra firepower. As it would turn out, after arrival in May 1943, neither of the battleships would ever see their German counterparts. Alabama and South Dakota spent a few months training and sailing with the home fleet, operating with British battleships on such missions as reinforcing garrisons. She would also join in similar operations as HMS Furious, making threatening moves toward Norway to keep the Germans guessing and looking away from the actual invasion of Sicily. There was some level of hope this would draw out Tirpitz as well, though the Germans didn't rise to the bait and kept their Queen of the North parked in her fjord. It would, admittedly, be a fun alternate history scenario to imagine how that fight would have gone, so maybe that'll be a video later on. In any case, with the Germans resisting the bait, Alabama and South Dakota were detached from the British home fleet on August 1st, 1943, and sent back home. Arriving on August 9th, Alabama spent 10 days on overhaul and repairs. By the 20th, after completion of this process and with working up complete, the battleship was sent off to join the offensives in the Pacific. Having missed her chance at fighting the Germans, she now got her chance to fight the Japanese. Albeit that this would, as could be expected, mostly consist of blasting islands and fighting off air attack. Her first taste of action, then, was the invasion of the Gilbert Islands. In this, Alabama covered the aircraft carriers and supported the landings upon Tarawa and Macon atolls. Though, save for driving off air attack on the night of November 26th, she saw little actual action of her own. So it would go for the rest of 1943 and the first half of 1944. She had a couple moments of excitement, here and there, but most of it involved escorting the carriers around. There are actually a couple of notable things, though. On December 8, 1943, she joined with other fast battleships to bombard Japanese shore positions. This was not to support an invasion, but to damage Japanese phosphate production. In this, she was successful, though no enemy ships showed up to contest the action. Secondly, after a refit in Pearl Harbor in January 1944, which replaced her port outboard propeller, Alabama returned to action. This consisted, again, of sailing around helping carriers and blasting Japanese islands in support of the invasion of the Marshall Islands. Such was to be expected at this point in the war and isn't anything special. What is special, and the second notable thing, is Alabama suffering from the South Dakota-class bad luck. While fighting off Japanese air attack on February 21st, 1944, one of her 5-inch mounts managed to succeed in hitting its target. It's just that the target ended up being, completely by accident, the back of one of her other 5-inch mounts. In firing upon her own hull, Alabama killed 5 of her crew and wounded a further 11. This mishap took place while supporting operations against the Mariana Islands that ended by February 22nd, whereupon Alabama moved on to new targets. Come March 1944, she was in action against Japanese targets in the Caroline Islands. As part of the screen for the new USS Yorktown, Alabama shot down a Japanese aircraft on the night of March 29th. Her following service, for the rest of this operation, was much the same, as was her stint in April, serving with USS Enterprise on operations off the coast of New Guinea. It must be noted, once more, that her service in this time period can be best summed up as sailed up and down the Pacific, bombarding Japanese-held islands, and fighting off air attack. I could go into detail on each and every individual action, but the vast majority are more or less the same story, just in different locations. There is a quote here that demonstrates this, from a bombardment of a Japanese airfield and seaplane base in the Carolines that she undertook prior to the invasion of the Marianas. As Alabama's captain Fred Kirtland subsequently noted, the bombardment of 70 minutes duration was conducted in a leisurely manner. The fact that a shore bombardment can be described as leisurely really says it all. And so Alabama's service would go, at least until the actual invasion of the Marianas. This began in a similar manner, with her covering the carriers and supporting the invasion. It would quickly become more exciting with the Japanese counterattack that became the Battle of the Philippine Sea. In this, Alabama would be the first ship to pick up the Japanese attack on radar. This is an important enough achievement on its own, however, another note can be made here. In researching for this video, I came across an article from the U.S. Naval Institute. Among other things, it talks of how Alabama received an improved air search radar in August of 1943. Because of time constraints, it was loaded aboard and intended for installation at Pearl Harbor. Alabama's captain, the same Fred Kirtland mentioned previously, decided he wouldn't wait and sent his ship on towards her first missions. So the crew, on their own with nothing but some help from a nearby repair ship, removed her old radar and fitted the new one, 160 feet above the waterline, without proper equipment to do so. It was this radar, and the operators of it, that made the detection report on June 19, 1944, of the incoming Japanese attack. The first sighting, considered an anomaly, was at 190 miles out. A second sighting at 141 miles was considered more valid. This second sighting was quickly confirmed by USS Iowa after a request for a follow-up report. Alabama's prompt detection of the incoming attack likely aided in fighting it off. Her own guns, however, would not contribute anywhere near as much as the planes that did most of the fighting. Only 2 of the Japanese raids came close enough for Alabama to engage with her own weapons. The first saw a bomb hit South Dakota, unlucky as that ship is, and the second saw Alabama keep the Japanese from following up on that hit with torpedo bombers. In focusing so heavily on that, though, a dive bomber managed to almost hit Alabama herself, with 2 near misses that did no damage. Nonetheless, while she did little to contribute directly to the turkey shoot, Alabama's sighting of the Japanese was considered so important that Admiral Lee, everyone's favorite American battleship commander, had this to say. In the matter of reporting initial bogeys, to Iowa, well done. To Alabama, very well done. Sometimes, and this really needs to be emphasized here, direct combat action isn't as important as support. And Alabama's early warning here is considered crucial to allowing the American carriers to hit the Japanese as far away from the fleet as they did. After this, however, she returned to her usual duties for much of 1944. She supported the carriers on their various raids, she helped with invasions of places such as Ulithi, and other such things. Even in the operations off the Philippines in October 1944, she continued in this role. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, she was part of Halsey's force when it moved on the Japanese decoy force. This prevented Alabama from being present to contest the Japanese center forces' attack on Taffy 3, though she was eventually sent back to try to counter the Japanese on October 25th. Alas, that was not meant to be, and Kurita slunk away without engaging the American battleships. In this, Alabama missed her last chance for a grand gun duel with the Japanese fleet. She would, instead, continue on her existing missions, at least until December 17th, at which point she had the misfortune of running into Typhoon Cobra, though she, luckily enough, escaped with only minor damage. Nonetheless, Alabama went in for repairs and would only return to service in late April of 1945. This service would see her support operations at Okinawa in May, ride out another typhoon in June, and then bombard the Japanese home islands in July. Throughout all of this, the most she saw were Japanese aircraft, and none of them dealt any damage to the battleship. In fact, such was Japan's lack of capable combat forces that when the war ended, Alabama was sailing happily off the coast of Honshu. When she sailed directly to Japan after the Japanese surrender, Alabama landed Marines and some of her own crew ashore, which were some of the first American forces to land on the home islands. After entering Tokyo Bay on September 5th to pick those men back up, Alabama proceeded to join the usual Operation Magic Carpet operations to bring American servicemen home. It would, as it turned out, be her last major operation. For Alabama would be decommissioned to reserve on January 9th, 1947. She would remain there until taken fully out of service on June 1st, 1962. Here her story might have ended, if not for the fact that citizens of her namesake state intervened. The USS Alabama Battleship Commission raised enough funds to preserve the ship as a museum. $800,000 were raised for that fund, an eighth of which came from children in the state. As would later happen with the Iowas, the Navy handed the ship over for preservation. She was taken in tow in July of 1964, though as it would turn out, Even in this, the South Dakota-class luck struck one final time. One of her tugs managed to sink on the way to Mobile, Alabama. Luckily, the battleship herself managed to avoid any major mishaps. She even got the chance to be escorted by USS Lexington, a fellow World War II veteran that was still in service at this point. Arriving at her new home on September 14th, Alabama had to wait for a channel to be dredged before she was moved to what would become her permanent berth. The Navy never felt any need to bring her back into service, though that didn't stop them from raiding her for spare parts. In the 1980s, with the Iowas being dragged back into service, the Navy had a sudden need for spare parts. As such, they took the only supply of those parts: Alabama, North Carolina, and Massachusetts. Each of these ships were stripped of anything useful to restore the Iowas to service, which left them a tad bare on the inside. Still, Alabama avoided the scrapyard and remains a museum to this day. Albeit one that had to undergo major repairs in the early 2000s, especially after she was damaged by Hurricane Katrina in September of 2005. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.